Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. Something slow, something gentle, something perfect for when the lights are dim and you just want to float. We're going back a very, very long time. So long, in fact, that most of what you think you know about these people probably came from movies where everyone's running around screaming, hunting mammoths, or discovering fire in a very dramatic aha moment. Yeah, those aren't exactly bedtime-friendly images. So let's take a deep breath and instead think about what your average caveman or cavewoman might have actually done on an ordinary day. Spoiler alert, it's not all spears and survival. Most of the time, it was kind of boring, or at least boring in a very human, relatable way. Cavemen had chores, they had families, they got frustrated, they got bored, and they stared at the sky and probably sighed a lot. So dim the lights, get cozy, and let's float back to a time when life was slow, very slow. First, let's talk about the morning, or whatever passed for morning, because without clocks, a caveman's morning was just when the sun came up and they felt like it. Imagine waking up, stretching, grumbling, and thinking, do I really want to leave my rock bed today? And the answer, unfortunately, was yes, but not because someone was chasing you with a saber-toothed tiger, but because someone, probably a slightly irritable spouse, needed food. Food was the main agenda, of course, and food hunting wasn't exactly what Hollywood tells you. Most cavemen weren't chasing mammoths around like in some epic action scene. That was dangerous, inefficient, and frankly, a little foolish. Instead, they probably spent hours poking at roots, picking berries, and catching whatever small animals wandered close enough. Think rabbits, fish, maybe even the occasional bird that wasn't fast enough. Not glamorous, but practical. And speaking of berries, imagine the frustration of spending 30 minutes picking tiny fruits only to realize they're bitter. That's the prehistoric version of burning toast. Let's float over to another part of their day, which is mostly just staring at things. Cavemen didn't have Netflix, they didn't have Instagram. So after they'd gathered some food, they often had long stretches of nothingness. This is where imagination came in. Some scholars think that early humans probably sat around, looked at clouds, or maybe doodled on rocks. And by doodles, I mean cave paintings. But even cave paintings weren't an artistic awakening every day. Sometimes it was just one person, bored, poking a stick in mud, thinking, I'll make a handprint. That seems fine. And then maybe a mammoth if they were feeling fancy. Family life, by the way, was a huge part of the daily grind. Cavemen lived in small groups, mostly family groups. Everyone had roles. Adults did most of the foraging and hunting. Children had the critical job of not dying and learning how to do that same boring stuff eventually. And elders? They mostly gave advice that was ignored. Very little has changed in that department. Picture a grumpy grandparent wagging a finger, muttering something about, when I was your age, we didn't eat bitter berries, and the younger ones pretending to listen. Now, hygiene, or lack thereof, is another point of interest. Without showers, toothpaste, or even soap as we know it, cavemen had a very different approach to staying clean. Mud baths probably doubled as hygiene and entertainment. Sometimes they might have used sand or certain plants to scrub themselves, but mostly it was a go-with-the-flow kind of deal. And honestly, that makes sense if your day is mostly walking around looking for food or staring at the horizon wondering why the clouds are shaped like goats. Speaking of horizons, let's talk about the social interactions, which were surprisingly sophisticated for sleepy little hunter-gatherers. Cavemen communicated. They grunted, they gestured, they had some proto-language that allowed them to complain about weather, food, and each other. There were arguments, definitely. Maybe someone took the last berry, or the fire wasn't hot enough, or someone's pet mammoth,
because yes, some people had tame animals probably, was being annoying. And after those disputes, they calmed down, because that's what humans do. They're remarkably resilient when nothing catastrophic is happening. Oh, and rest. Cavemen rested a lot, not always because they were tired, but because resting was a natural way to pass time and avoid unnecessary risks. Running into a saber-toothed tiger is exhausting and stressful, so sometimes the best choice was literally just to sit under a tree, chew on a root, and watch the clouds drift by. Modern people might call it lazy. Prehistoric people called it survival strategy. Or maybe they just enjoyed it. Who knows? Let's not forget the occasional creative spark. Even though the daily life of a caveman was mostly routine, humans are humans.
They drew, they sang softly. They maybe even made up tiny games for the kids. And when a mammoth or deer wandered close enough, they might have done a little hunting practice. Not for survival necessarily, but because throwing sticks and spears is fun when you've got nothing else to do. Or so I imagine. Evenings were similarly uneventful. People gathered around the fire, if they had one. Fires were tricky. They were warmth, light, and safety all rolled into one, but they required tending. Someone had to make sure the flames didn't die, and someone had to make sure the smoke didn't make everyone cough too much. Then they ate whatever they'd collected during the day. Maybe they had stories. Mostly, though, these stories were simple. I saw this deer. I fell in a mud puddle. And somehow, these small observations became the glue that held communities together, because when your life is slow, details matter. And eventually, the night would come. The stars would appear, probably much brighter than they are today because there was no city lighting to wash them out. Cavemen looked up and probably wondered the same things we do. Why are there so many stars, and is there something bigger out there? Then they'd lie down on the softest surface they could find, rock, grass, maybe an animal hide, and fall asleep. Safe, for now. So that, in a nutshell, or a slightly longer nutshell, is what a caveman's day probably looked like. It wasn't heroic, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, slow, sometimes frustrating, often boring, but somehow it worked. And if we think about it, it's oddly comforting, because the same basic elements are still part of our lives today. We eat, we complain, we try to be creative, and eventually we sleep. And that's enough. So, now that we've set the scene with the broad strokes of caveman life, food, boredom, and cloud gazing, let's float a little closer into individual experiences. Because of course, even back then, humans were not a monolithic blob of survival instincts. No, some cavemen were naturally grumpy, some were dreamers, some were accidentally clever, and some, well, just got really, really bored a lot. Let's meet one of them. We'll call him Thog, because it feels right. Thog lived in a small band somewhere in what is now Europe around 30,000 years ago. Thog was what modern anthropologists might politely call a character. He had a fondness for poking things, sticks, rocks, and occasionally other people, though mostly accidentally. His mornings began slowly, because Thog didn't wake up immediately when the sun rose. No, he spent a few minutes just staring at his stone pillow, probably thinking about yesterday's mud bath or why the berries were too bitter again. When Thog finally did get up, he had chores, but he had his own style. He wasn't efficient. Oh no, efficiency was for the other people in the band, the ones who liked to gather berries in neat piles or sharpen sticks in straight lines. Thog's approach was more experimental. He would pick a root, chew it thoughtfully, and then toss it aside because he decided he didn't like the color. He might poke at a bird nest just to see if the eggs moved, and if someone told him off, he'd shrug and wander away muttering something that probably sounded like a complaint about unfair distribution of sunlight. Thog had friends, or at least companions he tolerated. One of them was Gara, who was the opposite of Thog. Gara was extremely methodical. She liked her berries sorted by size, her sticks lined up perfectly, and her fire carefully tended. She often shook her head at Thog, muttering, "One day all this chaos will be your undoing." Thog would nod politely, then immediately knock over a pile of rocks for fun.
Speaking of fires, tending to one was a big part of caveman's social life. Fires weren't just warmth, they were gatherings, kind of like a prehistoric living room. Around the fire, stories were exchanged, which mostly meant recounting mundane events. I saw a deer. I fell in mud. Someone sneezed in the wrong direction. Very thrilling, yes, but in the soothing, lulling way, which is perfect for our purposes tonight. The fire was also where the occasional spark of creativity appeared. Thog, for instance, once tried arranging stones in a spiral, probably because he thought it looked pretty. He didn't know why, but it made him happy. Gara didn't approve, but she secretly appreciated it. Now let's talk about some less glamorous aspects. Cavemen got sick. Not dramatic plagues every week, but the usual: fevers, cuts, sprains, stomach aches from slightly rotten food. Medicine was rudimentary. A plant here, a leaf there, maybe some chanting if you were feeling fancy, but mostly they just waited it out. Illness slowed everything down, which in some ways was a blessing. It gave people time to lie down and think, or stare at the fire and wonder what the clouds were doing. Hygiene deserves a second mention because it's kind of fascinating. Imagine trying to clean yourself without running water or soap.
Cavemen experimented in a very low-effort way. Mud, sand, leaves, these were all tools in the early personal grooming toolbox. Some probably smelled less than others, which might explain why social interactions were sometimes awkward. And yet, somehow, they managed. People always adapt, even if it's not glamorous. Let's drift over to the topic of tools, because you can't avoid tools entirely in caveman life. Tools were everywhere. Sticks, rocks, bones, and shells were shaped into everything from hunting implements to, basically, sticks and rocks shaped differently. Thog had a favorite stick, which he called Sharpie. Sharpie was not very sharp, but Thog believed in it anyway. He used it for poking things, stirring fire, and occasionally as a conversation starter. "This is Sharpie," he'd say to a particularly unamused Gara. "He's reliable." And for some reason, the others pretended to understand. Food strategies were surprisingly full of personality. Some cavemen liked to try new foods all the time, which often ended in mild discomfort. Others stuck strictly to known berries, roots, and meats, and would loudly complain if someone offered them something unfamiliar. Thog experimented constantly, chewing leaves, roots, and occasionally tasting things that smelled edgy. Gara, by contrast, made very sensible choices, always reminding everyone that we need to survive tomorrow, which, in a sleepy, reflective way, is a good principle. Cavemen also had hobbies, or at least passing interests. Painting is the obvious one, though as mentioned before, it wasn't always aesthetic. Sometimes it was a handprint, sometimes it was an abstract scribble, and sometimes it was a questionable attempt at drawing an animal that looked more like a blob with legs. Yet these little artistic sparks were important. They gave people a sense of time, a sense of identity, and maybe even a mild ego boost. "Look," one might say, "I made a blob. This is me. Admire it." And then there were rituals, small, repetitive actions that structured life. Maybe someone always poked the fire 3 times before eating. Maybe they circled a rock clockwise before sleep. These habits might seem trivial, but they helped structure a slow, gentle rhythm. And in a world without calendars, clocks, or smartphones, structure was comforting. Some cavemen were introverted, others were loud. Some were brave, some were lazy, and sometimes laziness was an entire personality trait. Thog, for example, often spent whole afternoons just lying on his rock bed, thinking about nothing at all. Maybe he stared at clouds. Maybe he wondered if someone else's berries tasted better. Maybe he tried to count how many leaves fell from a tree, which probably didn't go well. And that's okay. Laziness, as it turns out, is timeless. Cavemen also had disputes, though rarely dramatic. Mostly these involved resources, personal space, or mild social misunderstandings. "You took my stick. That berry was mine. Stop staring at the clouds like that." And then, just as quickly, everything was forgotten. Time was slow. Memories were short.
grudges weren't efficient. Survival favored forgiveness, or at least indifference. Evening routines varied, but equally slow. People might sit around the fire, poke at leftover food, or quietly experiment with a new stone tool. Conversations were simple. Jokes probably existed, though low-key. A bit of teasing here and there. Maybe someone pretended to trip over a rock for amusement. The world was quiet, predictable, and strangely comforting in its slowness. Eventually, the day ended. The sun dipped below the horizon. Fires dimmed. Cavemen found their spots on soft grass, animal hides, or rock surfaces and tried to sleep. Stars above, quiet all around. Thog, Gara, and the rest of the band closed their eyes, dreaming vaguely of tomorrow's berries, tomorrow's mud, or tomorrow's new stick to poke with. And just like that, the day passed. Not dramatically, not heroically, simply, slowly. And in that simplicity, there's something gentle, even soothing. Cavemen were people, after all. Their days were slow, filled with small frustrations and tiny triumphs, but also with quiet moments that we can still relate to today. They remind us that life doesn't always need drama to be meaningful. Sometimes it just needs to exist. We've met Thog. We've seen his slow, pokey mornings, his messy stick arrangements, and his oddly meditative afternoons. But Thog didn't live in isolation. Cavemen, despite what movies tell us, were very social creatures. Not in a loud, dramatic way, more like a quiet, sometimes awkward group of humans all figuring out how to survive together without killing each other over berries. Let's start with the family unit. Cavemen usually lived in small bands, maybe 5 to 20 people. These bands were basically extended families. Adults had responsibilities: hunting, gathering, fire tending, keeping watch for predators, and occasionally offering unsolicited advice.
Children had responsibilities too, mostly consisting of stay alive and watch what the adults are doing so you can try it later, which, if you think about it, is basically every childhood ever. Family life was uneven. Some adults were strict, some were lazy, some had ideas about how the world should work and tried to enforce them, which usually led to mild grumbling. Let's imagine Thog's cousin Mira, who insisted that all berries must be washed before eating. This is a charming idea, except for the fact that it takes time and energy, and most people didn't care. Thog, of course, found this endlessly irritating. He pretended to comply, while secretly eating half a handful of dirty berries whenever Mira wasn't looking. Small acts of rebellion were common, and, in a slow, sleepy way, almost endearing. Some adults naturally took on leadership roles, not because they were particularly brave or wise, but sometimes just because they annoyed everyone slightly less than the other options. Grak, for instance, wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but he could make decisions about which direction to move in without starting a full-scale berry war. So the others let him be chief, mostly out of convenience. Leadership in caveman bands was practical, quiet, and often temporary. Today's leaders might give speeches or write memos. Grak just nodded a lot and occasionally pointed at things, and everyone pretended that was guidance. Within the family, hierarchy also extended to small chores. Some people cooked, some people cleaned, which mostly meant poking at fire embers or moving rocks around. Some people, Grak being an expert, specialized in distraction. He would wander off mid-gathering just to see if the clouds were doing anything interesting, which was both infuriating and harmless. And sometimes someone just sat quietly, meditating on the smell of moss. Every role had its place. Children, meanwhile, learned slowly. Early humans weren't in a rush to teach them everything at once. Hunting was dangerous, after all, so the first lessons were simple. Look at the berries, see which ones are good, avoid the sharp rocks, and for the love of all that is soft, don't fall in mud. Play was part of learning too. Children practiced throwing sticks, balancing on logs, or quietly observing adult mistakes. This is probably how early humans developed the combination of caution and curiosity that let the species survive.
Occasionally, the band had conflicts, usually over resources or personal space. Let's imagine a situation. Thog wanted to sleep next to the fire, but Mira insisted she had dibs. There were grumbles, some mild shoving, and eventually someone decided it didn't matter enough to argue further. Everyone adjusted slightly, and life went on. These micro-conflicts were common and mostly harmless. In a sense, they were like prehistoric traffic jams, inconvenient, mildly frustrating, but nothing life-altering. Food-sharing rituals were another interesting aspect. No one ate alone very often. Sharing was practical and social. A successful hunt or a particularly juicy batch of berries became a communal affair. But even sharing could be political. A generous individual might gain respect or mild envy. A stingy individual might be ignored the next day. Social status in this way was subtle. It wasn't about crowns or swords. It was about trust, reliability, and who brought the least rotten roots to the table. Sleeping arrangements were equally pragmatic. People slept close enough to maintain warmth, but not so close that someone's foot ended up on your face. Elders might have a slightly cushier spot, because experience is valuable even if it doesn't make you faster at poking sticks. Children slept near adults for protection, and sometimes pets, or domesticated animals, which were usually more practical than adorable, joined the group. Imagine a small, sleepy mammoth calf curling up at the edge of the rock circle. Not very heroic, but probably comforting. Cavemen had what we might now call personal quirks, which were subtly important for social dynamics. Thog, for instance, had the habit of tapping sticks in a rhythm that nobody else understood. Maybe it was a form of meditation, maybe it was boredom. Gera, meanwhile, always arranged firewood in neat, parallel lines. These quirks didn't disrupt life, but they added texture to the slow flow of days. They were signs that these people, despite their rough lives, were human in every sense. Occasionally, someone tried to innovate. Maybe a slightly smarter individual experimented with new tools or tried a different way of lighting fire. Results varied. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it failed spectacularly, producing more smoke than warmth. And the band would watch politely, then go back to their usual routines. Innovation was slow, cautious, and often accidental. But these tiny experiments laid the groundwork for the gradual accumulation of knowledge that eventually changed everything.
Rituals, on the other hand, added predictability. They weren't elaborate. Often they were repetitive, almost hypnotic. Perhaps someone always tapped a stick on a rock 3 times before eating. Perhaps they circled a fire clockwise before resting. These rituals helped structure life, providing small anchors in a world without calendars, clocks, or predictable weather. They were, in a quiet sense, comforting. Even leisure had its rhythms. Cavemen stared at clouds. They poked at sticks. They experimented with mud, leaves, and stones. They quietly observed animals. They occasionally laughed in a low-key, restrained way. And then they rested. And then they did it all again. Life was slow, deliberate, and repetitive, which, if you think about it, is exactly what makes it gentle for our bedtime journey. By the end of the day, the family, or band, settled around the fire one last time. Small discussions, occasional teasing, gentle grumbling. Everyone found their sleeping spot, stars above, the world quiet. The slow rhythm of life carried on, unchanged, simple, and strangely reassuring. Cavemen weren't heroes. They weren't running epic adventures. They were people, like us in some ways, facing a world that required patience, observation, and a little humor to survive. And that's the thing. Even in the simplicity, in the slowness, there is richness. The details matter. Who poked at which stick? Which berries were bitter? Who slept where? These small, mundane patterns created structure, identity, and social bonds. And they did it without urgency, without drama, without rush, just quietly, patiently existing.
We've wandered through the slow rhythm of caveman days, met Thog and his companions, and peeked into their tiny social hierarchies. Now let's float gently into what they did when they weren't gathering food, poking sticks, or negotiating berry rights. That is, what they did for entertainment, or as we might call it, small, quiet attempts at fun. Entertainment in caveman times wasn't flashy. There were no movies, no music playlists, and certainly no competitive sports leagues. Mostly, it was whatever passed the time in a gentle, minimally disruptive way. Sometimes that meant quietly observing animals, tracing their movements with a stick in the dirt, and speculating about how they got so good at moving without stepping on twigs. Sometimes it meant mild competitions. Who can jump over that log without falling? A high-stakes challenge with minimal actual danger. And then there was art. Ah, yes, the famous cave paintings. But don't imagine dramatic murals of charging mammoths or perfect horses. Most of the time, cave art was slow, repetitive, and often oddly abstract. A handprint on a wall, a stick figure of an animal that looks slightly like a blob, maybe a random swirl that nobody understood but everyone pretended was meaningful. Creating these marks wasn't heroic. It wasn't intended to impress anyone. It was more about leaving a small, quiet signature in the world. I existed here, a caveman thought, and I was bored enough to poke a stick in mud. Art also served practical purposes. Marks on walls could indicate a hunting path, the location of berries, or "do not step here, there is mud." Sometimes the lines were purely decorative, a gentle acknowledgement of boredom. And sometimes they were experiments with symmetry or repetition, early humans testing patterns, shapes, and ideas. It wasn't high art, it was experimental, soothing, and human. Music existed too, in a very rudimentary form. Someone might have banged a hollow log with a stick. Someone else might have blown into a bone like a primitive flute. It probably sounded questionable to modern ears, but the purpose wasn't perfection. It was rhythm, repetition, shared experience. Around the fire, it could lull children to sleep, synchronize group activities, or just give a few moments of mild amusement. And if someone played off-key, nobody cared. Mistakes were part of the charm. Communication, meanwhile, was developing slowly but steadily. Cavemen didn't have words the way we do today, but they had proto-language, grunts, gestures, pointing, and a series of vocalizations that conveyed meaning. Food over there, danger nearby, stop poking me with that stick. Sometimes subtle expressions, like the tilt of a head or hand wave, communicated as much as words. In some ways, it was very efficient, even if it seems hilariously limited to us now. And then there was symbolic thinking, which is one of the most fascinating aspects of early human life. Cavemen could begin to understand representation. A drawing is not a deer itself, but it means deer. A mark on a rock indicates a direction or warning. A rhythmic sound might signal a communal activity. This kind of thinking is slow to develop, subtle, and often accidental, but it laid the foundation for everything we now consider culture. It was a quiet, patient revolution. Let's take a closer look at a day involving art and communication. Imagine Thog, bored in the middle of a sunny afternoon. He grabs a stick, drags it across soft mud near the cave entrance, and creates a crude swirl. It doesn't impress anyone, but it keeps his hands busy. Mira, watching, adds a tiny handprint next to it because she has a more orderly approach. Grack, ever practical, just points at the marks and says something like, "Maybe tomorrow we can remember which direction the berries were." And just like that, art, entertainment, and practical communication merge. Games existed too, though we know very little about them. Some were likely races, some were tests of balance or strength, and some were simple mimicry of adult tasks. Children practiced hunting with sticks. Adults might have tested spear accuracy in low-risk situations, and everyone occasionally participated in quiet contests of memory or observation. These games were low energy, low stakes, and mostly intended to pass time and develop skills slowly. Perfect for bedtime storytelling, really. And then there were quiet rituals, overlapping with entertainment and symbolic thinking. Maybe someone always traced a circle in the dirt before eating. Maybe they hummed a tune while sharpening a stick. Maybe they tapped patterns on rocks, repeating the same sound for no reason other than satisfaction. These small acts created comfort, routine, and a sense of continuity. Life might have been slow, but it had rhythm. Evenings often combined many of these activities. The fire would be tended, food eaten, art admired or ignored, music played or not, and children and adults alike participated in small experiments. Someone tried a new pattern in the mud, someone else hummed a new rhythm, and everyone watched stars slowly appear. The sky itself was entertainment. The constellations, so bright without city lights, offered endless fascination. Stars drifted, clouds moved, and the world slowed around them. And finally, sleep. After poking sticks, drawing swirls, tapping rhythms, and humming melodies, the band would settle down. Children near adults, elders slightly cushioned, pets curling at the edges, the fire reduced to embers. The world was quiet, safe, gentle, and as eyelids closed and breathing slowed, cavemen drifted into dreams, probably dreams of berries, clouds, and abstract swirls in mud. Perhaps even dreams of tomorrow's subtle adventures, which would be as slow, deliberate, and slightly awkward as today. So that's the essence of caveman entertainment, art, and early communication. Not flashy, not dramatic, not heroic, but human, gentle, and strangely comforting. These people, our very distant ancestors, remind us that life doesn't need constant excitement to be meaningful. Sometimes it's enough to exist slowly, poke sticks in mud, trace abstract shapes, and watch the clouds drift by. And if you let your mind float there, alongside Thog, Mira, and Grak, it's almost impossible not to feel a small sense of calm. Life was simple, repetitive, and slow. And in that slowness, there is comfort, a lesson that travels across tens of thousands of years. We've seen a lot of ordinary, slow, and gentle aspects of caveman life, poking sticks, minor disputes, art, music, and the beginnings of communication. Now let's float into something slightly larger in scope. How cavemen experienced the changing seasons, how they managed food, and what happened when the day didn't go exactly as planned. Don't worry, nothing dramatic, just the slow unfolding of life in the way it probably happened. Seasons mattered. Very slowly, humans learned to notice them. Winter was cold, summer was hot, spring had mud, and autumn brought an abundance of berries, and sometimes mild frustration. Seasonal awareness helped organize the band's routines. In summer, people might spend more time gathering fruit or small animals, knowing that winter would be lean. In winter, movement slowed, as snow, cold, and scarce food made even walking a minor event. Let's consider Thog again. Summer mornings were long and lazy. The sun rose, and he stretched, squinted at the bright light, and probably muttered something like, "Too sunny." Berries were abundant, and hunting small animals was relatively easy. Some mornings, Thog simply lay under a tree counting clouds or imagining shapes because why rush when everything is plentiful? The band tolerated it. Summer is long. There is no immediate crisis. Autumn brought preparation. Berries might start to disappear. Small animals grew more cautious. Cavemen learned slowly that winter required foresight. This is when food preservation became mildly interesting. Drying meat, storing nuts, or hiding roots in cool, sheltered areas was common. Not glamorous, not dramatic, but very practical. The band would organize these tasks in quiet shifts. Someone collected berries. Someone layered meat on flat stones to dry. Someone poked at the fire to make sure it didn't die. And almost certainly Thog wandered off to see if the clouds were still shaped like animals.
Winter, of course, slowed everything down. Movement was harder. Gathering was slower. Hunting became more challenging, though cavemen learned strategies to cope. They might track animals more carefully, follow footprints, or simply wait for easy prey. And because life was slower, boredom increased. This is when creativity, entertainment, and rituals became most important. Art, music, and symbolic play helped pass the long, cold hours. Sometimes these activities overlapped. A stick tapped on a hollow log while someone traced mud patterns on the cave wall. All while children practiced balance on icy rocks. Quiet, repetitive, and strangely comforting. Spring brought renewal. Ice melted, birds returned, plants sprouted. Cavemen were quietly grateful, though not dramatically so. Life simply resumed a slightly faster rhythm. The band ventured further, explored new berry patches, and experimented with tools. Speaking of tools. Tools were essential, but also a source of slow experimentation. Not every tool was perfect. Some were oddly shaped rocks that broke immediately. Some were sharpened sticks that were too short or too bendy. Occasionally, someone discovered a better method, maybe a stone sharper than usual, or a bone fashioned into a rudimentary scraper. These discoveries were small victories, celebrated quietly, often with a simple nod or grunt. Yes, this works, someone might think, poking at the object thoughtfully. And then, because humans are humans, the tool might be misplaced within minutes, prompting minor annoyance and a mild, sleepy search. Even small disasters happened. Hunting could fail, berries could spoil, mud could collapse underfoot. But unlike in dramatic stories, these events were rarely catastrophic. A failed hunt meant finding alternative food sources. Spoiled berries were mildly disappointing, but not life-threatening. Mud collapses resulted in wet socks and slightly irritated grumbling. And life went on. Cavemen adjusted slowly, with patience and low-key problem-solving. Sometimes weather added a twist. Rain could make mud everywhere, forcing people to move cautiously. Strong winds could put out fires, necessitating a small ceremony of rekindling flames. Snow could make berry picking nearly impossible, turning Thog's leisurely cloud washing into a slightly shivering affair. But these events were handled incrementally. No dramatic heroics, just observation, minor adjustment, and mild commentary. Well, it's raining again. That's fine. Let's move this stick over here. Food, again, was central. Daily meals were small, simple, and repetitive. Berries, roots, nuts, small animals, and occasional fish made up the bulk. Cavemen learned slowly to combine flavors, experiment with cooking methods, though not always successfully, and preserve resources for lean times. Eating was often communal. Meals doubled as social bonding. Minor disputes sometimes arose over who ate first, who took the best berries, or who let the fire die. But in general, these disagreements were gentle and resolved without much fuss. Tools and food preparation often overlapped. Rocks were used for cracking nuts, sticks for stirring cooking pits, bones for scraping meat.
and the discovery of a new method, like a sharper stone, was a small moment of quiet pride. I did it, someone might think, without ceremony. And then, inevitably, someone else would drop the tool, prompting a minor hunt across the cave floor. Even evenings followed a predictable rhythm. Fires tended, food consumed, children quietly experimenting, adults slowly observing. Music, in its primitive form, sometimes accompanied the process, tapping sticks, blowing into hollow bones, softly humming while working. Art and rituals interlaced with chores, patterns traced in mud, careful arrangements of stones, repetitive gestures before meals. All of it soothing, repetitive, structured. And finally, night descended. Stars glimmered, bright without city lights. Cavemen settled on sleeping spots, children near adults, elders slightly cushioned, pets at the periphery. Embers glowed softly, breathing slowed, thoughts drifted. Berries, clouds, patterns, tomorrow's minor experiments. And then sleep. Life went on, slow, gentle, predictable, and in that rhythm there was comfort. Cavemen weren't adventurers or heroes. They were patient observers, subtle experimenters, quiet artists, and gentle problem solvers. Their lives, in their mundane repetition, were rich in small victories and gentle routines. And as we let our minds float with them through seasons, food, tools, and minor mishaps, it's calming to remember life doesn't need drama to be meaningful. Sometimes it just needs to move slowly, deliberately, and with tiny, subtle gestures of human creativity. We've spent several days, well, weeks in a sense, alongside Thog, Mira, Grak, and their little band. We've watched them poke sticks, draw abstract patterns, observe clouds, and deal with the slow passing of seasons. But life, even in its gentle monotony, occasionally required movement. Not dramatic adventures, not heroic quests, but small-scale exploration and migration. Because sometimes berries ran out, water shifted, or mud got inconveniently deep. Cavemen, like most humans, were naturally curious. Not in an ambitious, let's conquer the world kind of way, but in a practical, let's see what's over that hill kind of way. Bands would send small groups to scout. Usually, these scouts were experienced adults, reliable enough not to wander off into a bog or provoke a bear unnecessarily. Sometimes it was Thog, because he wandered anyway, so why not formalize it? Exploration was slow. People observed carefully, recorded paths mentally, or sometimes by scratching marks in mud or stone, and returned to share information. There's a berry patch past the stream. That rock looks funny. Don't step there, mud is deep. These notes were shared verbally or through gestures, and if someone got lost, it was usually mild panic rather than full-blown tragedy. Everyone waited, grumbled quietly, and eventually retrieved the wanderer. Migration happened rarely, but deliberately. When resources dwindled, berries gone, game scarce, water too far, bands would relocate. It wasn't a dramatic caravan across endless plains. It was a careful, measured movement, one step at a time, with everyone checking on everyone else. Elders grumbled, children dawdled, Thog explored. Mira meticulously arranged collected berries into baskets, making sure nothing squashed along the way. And after a few days, the new site became home. Fires were rebuilt, sleeping arrangements adjusted, life continued, slightly changed, but predictably so. Even within the band, social dynamics could be mildly complicated. Rivalries were subtle. Who got the sunniest sleeping spot? Who led the berry gathering? Who got to poke the fire first? These small disagreements rarely escalated into anything dramatic. Mostly they involved sighs, grumbles, gentle sarcasm, or moving one's stick to a slightly better position. Grak, as a leader, mediated these tiny disputes with minimal commentary. Okay, let's not fight, just swap positions, that's fine. Hierarchy was practical.
It wasn't about prestige or titles, it was about reliability, experience, and subtle influence. Someone who consistently gathered the best berries, maintained the fire without complaint, or remembered the location of water sources gained quiet respect. Someone who wandered too much, forgot tools, or misplaced meat occasionally might receive mild admonition or gentle teasing, but remained part of the group. Survival depended on cohesion, not ego. Exploration and migration also allowed for small observations of the natural world. Cavemen noticed patterns in animal behavior, plant growth, water flow, and weather. Some of these were accidental discoveries. If you dig here, the water is sweet. These berries ripen after this type of rain. Slowly, quietly, humans were learning to predict and adapt. And yet, the pace was unhurried. There was no rush to catalog everything perfectly. Observation was steady, patient, and gentle. Hunting during exploration was similar. Small, careful, low stakes. Not mammoth-chasing heroics, but quietly tracking deer, rabbits, or birds. Often hunts ended in partial success. Maybe one animal caught, maybe nothing. If nothing, the band gathered what they could and moved on. Minor frustration, but nothing more. Life was slow, and patience was a practical necessity. Evenings after exploration had their own rhythm. The band settled near the new campfire, shared small observations, occasionally traced marks in mud or on rock, and quietly adjusted to new routines. Children mimicked adults, learning paths, observing tools, and gradually absorbing the unspoken rules of patience, observation, and minor social negotiation. Sometimes rivalries emerged during these adjustments. You took my sleeping spot. I want that berry patch. Stop poking my stick. These conflicts were subtle. They involved gentle vocalizations, rolling eyes, maybe a soft nudge, and then everyone adjusted. The rhythm of social life carried forward, slow and steady. And as night fell, stars returned in their brilliant, unpolluted splendor. Campfires dimmed, everyone found their places to sleep. Children snuggled near adults, elders slightly cushioned, pets at the edges. The quiet of the land, the slow rhythm of life, and the gentle exhaustion of movement and observation lulled the band to rest. Dreams were probably about tomorrow's subtle tasks, small exploration, safe hunting, better berry collection, or noticing cloud shapes. In this way, life carried on. Exploration, minor migration, subtle rivalries, and patient observation. Cavemen weren't heroes, they weren't dramatic adventurers. They were quietly persistent, adaptive, and patient. Their lives were slow, measured, filled with gentle learning, minor frustrations, and small victories. And in that quiet rhythm, there was comfort. So as we let our minds drift alongside Thog, Mira, Grok, and their band, it's calming to remember. Human life, even tens of thousands of years ago, could be slow, predictable, and subtly intricate. Drama wasn't necessary. Heroics weren't required. Observation, patience, and small acts of adaptation were enough to sustain life and to lull us into the gentle calm that comes from understanding a world moving at a very human, very slow pace. We've wandered through daily life, seasonal routines, exploration, migration, and subtle social rivalries. But there's one quiet aspect of caveman life that often goes unnoticed: the stories they told, the small rituals they performed around food and fire, and the tiny, personal reflections that probably passed through their minds at the end of long days. Let's start with storytelling. Cavemen didn't have books. They didn't have screens. What they had were experiences, observations, and the occasional need to entertain or instruct. Storytelling was practical and social. Around the fire, someone might recount what happened that day. I saw a rabbit by the stream. I tripped in the mud. Or Fog poked the wrong stick again. These stories weren't dramatic. They weren't epic sagas.
They were simple, mundane, slightly humorous, and perfect for passing time. Children loved these stories, not because they were thrilling, but because repetition made them predictable and comforting. Over time, stories evolved. Perhaps a particularly clever observation became part of oral tradition. Do not step near the rock that wobbles. Or, if clouds look like goats, rain comes tomorrow. Subtle, practical wisdom wrapped in narrative, slowly shaping group memory and behavior. Rituals around food and fire were equally important. Meals weren't just about sustenance, they were moments of social bonding. Someone tended the fire while others distributed food. Perhaps a small gesture of thanks occurred, a nod, a hum, a soft tapping on a rock. Food was shared deliberately, carefully, with an awareness of fairness. Unequal distribution could provoke mild complaints, but overall these routines reinforced cooperation and cohesion. Fire itself was almost sacred. It provided warmth, safety, and a central gathering point. Cavemen might have circled it clockwise before resting, poked embers in a particular pattern, or hummed softly while maintaining it. These rituals weren't formal religion, not in the way we think of it, but they had structure, continuity, and subtle symbolic meaning. The fire represented life, community, and safety, and tending it was an act of quiet reverence. Proto-religious gestures likely emerged from observation of the natural world. Patterns in weather, the movements of animals, the cycle of seasons, all could inspire gestures or small rituals. Perhaps someone left a stone on a particular mound, whispered to the clouds, or gently tapped a stick on the ground as a sign of respect for unseen forces. These actions weren't dramatic or dogmatic. They were experimental, intuitive, and comforting. Small acts of control in a world that was mostly slow, patient, and occasionally unpredictable. Reflection, too, played a role. At the end of the day, after poking sticks, drawing patterns, and tending fire, cavemen probably had brief moments of quiet thought. What had they learned today? Which berries were good? Did the clouds look promising? Was that rabbit track significant? These reflections were subtle, often private, and remarkably human. They helped shape decisions, improve routines, and prepare for the next day, all without urgency or noise. Let's imagine Thog, after a long day of wandering, stick-poking, and minor observation. He sits by the embers, warming his hands, watching the soft glow. Mira carefully arranges the remaining berries. Grok occasionally nods at the fire, satisfied that everything is in order. Children whisper, laugh softly, and trace patterns in the dirt. Fog reflects on the day, the berries he found, the stick he misplaced, the cloud shapes that amused him. And then, slowly, he lies down, listening to the gentle crackle of the fire, feeling safe and drifting toward sleep. Even these small routines, the storytelling, the fire rituals, the gestures of respect, and the reflections contributed to social cohesion. Bands survived because they observed, remembered, shared, and occasionally laughed at small mistakes. Social bonds were reinforced, patience was rewarded, and life continued, slow, repetitive, and comforting. Nighttime was quiet. Stars sparkled above. The fire's glow softened. Cavemen nestled in their sleeping areas, children close to adults, elders slightly cushioned, pets at the edges. Everyone rested. Dreams were likely gentle, filled with patterns, clouds, berries, and small successes of the day. And in that quiet, slow passage of time, there was satisfaction. Not heroic, not dramatic, just human. So as we drift with Thog, Mira, Grok, and their band through these simple stories,
Rituals and reflections, it becomes clear life doesn't need excitement to be meaningful. The rhythm of observation, cooperation, and quiet reflection is enough. It's slow, repetitive, and deeply comforting. And if we allow ourselves to float alongside them, it's almost impossible not to feel that same calm, gentle satisfaction as the world slowly, patiently moves on. We've drifted alongside Thog, Mira,
Grack and their little band, through daily routines, exploration, subtle rivalries, and quiet reflection. But life wasn't entirely predictable. Occasionally, something slightly out of the ordinary happened. Seasonal events, gatherings, or minor celebrations that broke the monotony in a gentle, socially reinforcing way. Not dramatic festivals, not epic pageantry, just small, slow, comforting markers of time. Cavemen were attuned to the seasons, even if they didn't have calendars. Spring meant renewal. Summer brought abundance. Autumn hinted at scarcity. And winter, though harsh, created an intimate focus on the group. With these cycles came informal celebrations. Perhaps the first ripe berries of the season were shared with a quiet nod. Perhaps a successful hunt prompted a few rounds of gentle stick-tapping near the fire. The festival was the acknowledgement that life continued, predictably and safely for the moment. Around these informal gatherings, storytelling became central. Everyone, from elders to children, might contribute. Tales were practical, humorous, or observational. "I fell in mud today," Fogg might begin, exaggerating slightly for effect. "And then Mira rearranged my sticks," someone else might add. Laughter was soft, restrained, not raucous, but comforting in its repetition. These stories reinforced social bonds, helped transmit knowledge, and offered mild amusement, a necessary spice in otherwise slow, uneventful days. Games and competitions occasionally supplemented storytelling. These weren't high stakes or loud, simple contests: who could throw a small stick the farthest, who could hop across shallow mud pools without slipping, who could arrange stones most neatly, were common. The winners gained mild admiration, the losers grumbled or plotted their next attempt. No egos were shattered, no tears required. Just gentle testing of skills, a tiny sense of achievement, and subtle social reinforcement. Food often accompanied these moments. Shared meals became slightly more deliberate. Someone tended the fire while others passed around meat, berries, or roots. Perhaps a new flavor combination was tested cautiously. Someone might tap a stick rhythmically, another hummed softly, and a child traced patterns in the mud. The combination of nourishment, rhythm, and gentle interaction created a slow, comforting communal experience. Problem-solving, too, occurred in these gatherings. Not dramatic crises, but small everyday challenges. How to safely cross a muddy patch, how to reach a particularly stubborn berry bush, how to maintain embers overnight. Solutions were shared collectively, ideas proposed, tested, and refined over time. Someone might suggest, "Move this rock here." Another might add, "Put the berries on the flat side." Decisions weren't rushed, mistakes were minor and often humorous, and the process itself was bonding. Even minor competitions had subtle social functions. A child might be encouraged to hop across mud pools carefully, reinforcing patience and balance. An adult might practice spear placement in soft soil, improving accuracy while entertaining the group. Observers offered gentle advice, whispered teasing, or quiet applause. And afterwards, everyone returned to routine tasks: fire tending, berry sorting, or stick arrangement. Rhythm restored, calm preserved. As evening deepened, the band gradually transitioned from activities to rest. Fires burned steadily, food supplies dwindled, and children settled near adults. Elders adjusted sleeping arrangements slightly for comfort. Even pets or semi-domesticated animals curled at the edges. Conversations became whisper-like, repetitive and observational. "Cloud looks funny tonight." "Mud is soft tomorrow morning." "That berry tasted particularly sour today." Minor commentary, but meaningful within the context of slow social life. Stars became a quiet backdrop. Their brilliance, unpolluted by any artificial light, created an almost hypnotic effect. Some might trace constellations with their finger, noticing patterns and shapes. Some might hum softly, tap a rhythm on a stone, or leave a small mark in the dirt. The rituals of the day blended into a gentle meditation on continuity, safety, and slow passage of time. Finally, sleep arrived as the natural conclusion. Eyes closed, breathing slowed, fire embers glowed softly. Dreams were probably gentle, berries ripening, clouds drifting, abstract patterns in mud, small victories in competitions, or tomorrow's exploration. And through all of this, life maintained its slow, deliberate, comforting rhythm. In these small celebrations, storytelling circles, and gentle competitions, cavemen found subtle joy. They weren't dramatic, they weren't heroic, they were deeply human in their quiet persistence. The rhythms of life, observation, reflection, cooperation, minor amusement were enough. And if we float alongside them in imagination, we can feel the calm, patient satisfaction that comes from slow, shared existence. By now, we've watched Thog, Mira, Grok, and their band move through daily routines, seasonal rhythms, minor competitions, and gentle rituals. But the world was bigger than their immediate home. Occasionally, other bands of humans existed nearby, small groups who had similar routines, similar quirks, and similar approaches to survival. Interactions between these bands were slow, cautious, and often surprisingly polite. Neighboring bands were both opportunities and mild challenges. They provided potential allies for sharing resources, exchanging knowledge, and occasional social interaction. But they also required patience, observation, and subtle negotiation. The first contact might be as simple as noticing smoke from another fire, hearing distant voices, or spotting figures on a hill. Excitement, if it existed, was quiet, subtle, and expressed in measured gestures rather than dramatic shouting. When bands met more directly, social rituals became important. Greetings were mostly gestures and noises, perhaps a hand raised, a small grunt, or the careful presentation of food. Nothing flashy, nothing heroic. The purpose was clear: show peaceful intent, avoid misunderstandings, and slowly establish familiarity. Missteps could be mildly awkward: a misinterpreted gesture, a berry offered too soon, but rarely catastrophic. Humans, even then, were skilled at subtle negotiation. Resource sharing was one of the more interesting dynamics. If a neighboring band had an abundance of berries, meat, or suitable firewood, some exchange might occur. Perhaps a few berries traded for advice on finding clean water. Maybe one group demonstrated a slightly better method for sharpening a stick. These exchanges were small, deliberate, and often guided by observation. Both sides gained minor advantages without risking their entire survival. Efficiency, not heroics, dictated behavior. Disputes, of course, sometimes arose. That berry patch was ours first. You crossed my preferred route. Your fire smoke is too close to ours. These conflicts were mostly verbal, expressed through gestures, vocalizations, and subtle body language. Rarely did they escalate. Typically, one band would adjust slightly, move fire, pick a different patch of berries, or wait a bit before crossing a stream. Social flexibility was valued more than stubbornness because survival depended on maintaining peaceful relations. Cautious social expansion also occurred slowly. Bands sometimes merged temporarily during lean times. Perhaps a small group joined another for winter, sharing fire, food, and sleeping space. The integration was gradual, with everyone learning new names, patterns, and preferences. Thog, of course, would wander into slightly uncomfortable spaces, accidentally disturbing someone's stick arrangements. Mira would gently rearrange things, Grok would nod approvingly at the subtle negotiation of space, and life continued, slow, calm, and slightly adjusted. Observation played a huge role in interband interactions. By watching another group quietly, a band could learn subtle techniques, better hunting strategies, safer berry collection, or minor tool improvements. Observation was a slow, careful process. Mistakes were corrected gently, and knowledge accumulated incrementally. Communication, even between groups, was subtle. Pointing, gesturing, and simple vocalizations sufficed for most needs. Evenings with neighboring bands were low-key gatherings rather than celebrations. Fires glowed softly. Conversations were murmured. Children observed one another quietly, sometimes mimicking techniques or patterns from the other group. Adults exchanged tips, nudged sticks to demonstrate points, or quietly laughed at minor mistakes. No drama, no fanfare, just the slow, comforting rhythm of shared existence. Nightfall returned everyone to personal sleeping spaces, whether temporary or permanent. Stars above glimmered without obstruction. Fires burned low. Breathing slowed. The quiet social network of neighboring bands contributed to survival, comfort, and a subtle sense of connectedness. Bonds formed gently, without urgency or exaggeration. Through these quiet interactions, humans began to understand the value of cooperation beyond immediate kin. Sharing, observing, minor negotiation, and subtle dispute resolution laid the groundwork for more complex social networks. Yet, even in this early stage, everything remained slow, deliberate, and almost meditative. Life didn't need drama to persist. Small gestures, quiet observation, and gentle cooperation were enough.
So as we float alongside Thog, Mira, Grok, and now the extended community of neighboring bands, it becomes clear that early humans were patient, cautious, and surprisingly skilled at subtle social balance. Their world was slow, repetitive, and quiet, but within that calm rhythm, life thrived. We've accompanied Thog, Mira, Grok, and their band through daily life, rituals, minor competitions, seasonal rhythms, and even interactions with neighboring groups. But human life was slowly changing in subtle ways, ways that wouldn't be obvious in the moment, but would quietly shape the future. One of the most important of these changes was communication, not in a dramatic, let's invent writing sense, but in small, incremental steps toward shared understanding beyond immediate observation. Early humans began using symbols to communicate across space and time, marks on rocks, scratches in mud, small piles of stones. They were simple, practical, and surprisingly clever. A stone arranged in a line might indicate a safe path. A stick drawn in a certain way could mark a hunting territory. These symbols were rarely elaborate, but they worked. They transmitted information quietly, slowly, and with minimal effort. Language, in its earliest forms, developed alongside these symbols. Humans combined grunts, gestures, and facial expressions to convey meaning more precisely. Food here, danger there, move slowly. These were practical statements, but over time, repetition and subtle nuance allowed humans to communicate increasingly complex ideas. Thog might grunt, gesture toward a bush, and Mira would understand, berries are good here. Grok might point, tap a rock, and the children would learn, step carefully. Language was evolving gently, incrementally, without fanfare. Sometimes symbols and gestures overlapped. Imagine a series of scratches on a flat rock marking a path. A nearby stick points toward water. A low hum signals caution. All together, these signs form a coherent message. This way, carefully, water ahead. Observers might note the sequence, remember it, and transmit it to the next day's group. Small, quiet, cumulative knowledge.
Ideas spread between bands in much the same gentle way. Observation remained central. One group noticed a slightly more efficient way to sharpen a stone, or a new berry preparation technique, or a rhythm for fire tending. They demonstrated it through example. Another band picked it up slowly, tested it cautiously, and then integrated it into daily life. No formal instruction, no urgency, just incremental learning. Even minor innovations were meaningful. A better digging stick, a more stable arrangement of firewood, a small adjustment to a berry storage method. These tiny improvements accumulated over generations, and they spread quietly from one group to another. Observation, imitation, and gentle experimentation formed the slow backbone of cultural evolution. Within the band, teaching and learning were subtle and patient. Adults modeled behaviors, children watched, mistakes were corrected gently, successes were acknowledged with nods, soft noises, or small gestures. Fog might demonstrate poking a stick just the right way. Mira might correct him quietly. The children absorbed it all slowly, without urgency, memorizing patterns, rhythms, and minor techniques. Evenings often reinforced these subtle lessons. Around the fire, the band might practice patterns, tracing shapes in mud, tapping rhythms, mimicking hunting gestures, or demonstrating tool use. Storytelling intertwined with instruction. A tale about a slightly tricky berry patch doubled as a lesson in patience and observation. Minor rituals reinforced memory. Symbols, gestures, and verbal cues blended seamlessly into a slow, deliberate education system. Across space and time, these small acts of communication gradually built a shared understanding between groups. Symbols marked safe paths, grunts indicated danger or abundance, observed patterns improved tool use, storytelling transmitted practical knowledge. Ideas spread gently, incrementally, laying the groundwork for language, culture, and cooperative survival. And yet, life remained slow. Observation and experimentation were patient. Successes were celebrated quietly. Mistakes were corrected gently. Bands maintained continuity while subtly improving efficiency. Social bonds strengthened. Minor disputes resolved themselves. And through all of this, humans, our distant ancestors, were learning, teaching, and communicating in the softest, most subtle ways imaginable. Finally, the day ended. Stars twinkled above, fires burned low, children nestled near adults, elders rested in comfort, animals curled at the edges. Thoughts of minor achievements, symbols discovered, grunts exchanged, and paths observed drifted through sleepy minds. And as the band fell asleep, life continued, quietly, slowly, and reassuringly. In this gradual, deliberate unfolding, we can see the first threads of culture, communication, and shared knowledge.
Not heroic, not dramatic, just human, gentle, persistent, and surprisingly comforting in its quiet repetition. Fog, Mira, Grak, and their band have established a slow, steady rhythm. They navigate daily routines, seasonal changes, neighboring bands, subtle communication, and quiet innovations. But a quiet evolution was occurring in one of the most essential aspects of survival: tools. Simple sticks and stones had long been helpful. Now, small steps toward more complex tool-making were beginning to shape the daily life of the band. Tools were never flashy. A new tool might be a sharpened stone for cutting meat, a slightly stronger digging stick, or a smooth piece of wood for carrying berries. The process was slow, patient, and repetitive. Thog experimented cautiously, testing edges, adjusting angles, feeling textures. Mira arranged tools neatly, making sure none would roll away. Grak nodded in quiet approval at effective designs. Children observed, imitated, and occasionally wandered off with a tool in hand, learning its purpose the hard way. Small hunts became increasingly coordinated as tool-making improved.
Not epic mammoth hunts, those were for stories, not sleep-friendly realism, but modest hunts for rabbits, birds, or fish. The band would move slowly, quietly, using sticks, stones, or sharpened implements to guide or catch prey. Success wasn't guaranteed. Sometimes they returned with little, sometimes with enough to share comfortably. The key was coordination, timing, observation, and subtle, patient strategy. Observation of the environment was crucial. Cavemen noticed animal behavior, plant cycles, water levels, and weather patterns. These observations were gentle, incremental, and quiet. Thog might crouch near a stream, watching the ripple of fish. Mira might study leaf shapes, noting which berries ripened first. Grak might track footprints, mentally mapping paths. Children observed too, absorbing this knowledge slowly, like seeds taking root. Even minor failures were instructive. A stick too short for a task, a rock that broke unexpectedly, a berry patch that yielded little. Each failure was observed, noted, and adjusted. The band learned slowly. Techniques improved incrementally. Success was not celebrated loudly, just acknowledged quietly. A small nod, a subtle grunt, a soft rearrangement of sticks. Daily rhythms were also reinforced by these activities. Morning routines, stretching, minor observation, berry gathering. Midday, tool maintenance, slow exploration, minor social interactions. Afternoon, small hunts, observational experiments, gentle play for children. Evening, fire tending, communal storytelling, minor competitions, quiet reflection. Night, sleep, stars above, embers glowing, gentle breathing. Each day resembled the last, yet with small variations, subtle enough to keep life interesting but not disruptive. Even leisure activities intertwined with practical skills. A child playing with a stick might inadvertently practice spearing techniques. A pattern traced in mud might double as a map for berry collection. A hummed rhythm might help coordinate movement during small hunts. Work and play flowed seamlessly, slowly, deliberately, reinforcing knowledge without urgency. Food remained central. Sharing meals reinforced social bonds, taught lessons, and provided structure. Minor disputes occurred: who got the better berries, who tended the fire, who poked the wrong stick, but they were resolved quietly, with minimal fuss. Harmony was maintained not through power or dominance, but through patience, observation, and subtle social negotiation. Even small innovations, like a slightly better grip on a spear or a smoother method of carrying berries, were noted and integrated gradually. The rhythm of daily life allowed for experimentation, observation, and learning, all in a slow, predictable cycle. Successes and failures, minor competitions, gentle disputes, and quiet reflection all blended into a comforting pattern of existence. By nightfall, the band would settle near embers, children snuggled close, elders cushioned slightly, and pets or animals curled at the edges. The gentle glow of fire, soft murmurs, and the faint sound of distant wildlife created an atmosphere of calm. Thoughts of minor accomplishments, observed patterns, and subtle innovations drifted through sleepy minds. And as everyone drifted off to sleep, the band remained safe, warm, and gently prepared for another slow, deliberate day. In this rhythm, tools, coordinated hunts, careful observation, and quiet reflection, life was simple, measured, and profoundly human. No heroic gestures, no dramatic crises, just patient observation, gentle experimentation, and the slow accumulation of knowledge that would shape generations to come. After all our quiet wanderings with Thog, Mira, Grak, and their band, we have seen days filled with slow routines, subtle observations, minor competitions, Small discoveries, gentle disputes, seasonal rhythms.
Early communication, symbolic markings, and carefully coordinated hunts. And now, as life drifts toward its natural conclusion, we can reflect on the patterns that made it work, the simple, quiet structures of survival, cooperation, and human ingenuity. By this point, symbolic culture had become a small but important thread in daily life. Marks in mud, scratches on rock, patterns traced near sleeping areas, and small arrangements of stones were not just practical, they were personal. Someone might leave a swirl in the mud simply because it was satisfying. Someone else might arrange rocks in a line because it helped them remember a path. These tiny expressions, so ordinary, so subtle, were the beginnings of personal expression. Small gestures that said, without words, I was here, I observed, I participated. Social norms had evolved gently alongside these expressions. Leadership was quiet, practical, and shared. Grack, as the informal leader, mediated small disputes, organized minor tasks, and approved subtle innovations. Thog wandered and experimented. Mira carefully arranged tools, berries, and firewood. Children learned observation, patience, and minor problem solving through imitation and gentle correction. Rules weren't written or formalized. They were learned slowly, reinforced quietly, and followed naturally. Life's minor challenges, weather, scarce food, tricky hunts, lost tools, were addressed patiently. Mistakes were not sources of drama. They were learning opportunities. Failures were small. Successes were quietly acknowledged. Observation, reflection, and gentle experimentation created a rhythm of life that was predictable, soothing, and safe. Evenings held their own calm rituals. Fires glowed low. Stories were told, mundane, practical, slightly humorous. Music might be attempted on hollow sticks or bones. Children traced patterns in mud. Adults adjusted sleeping spaces. Minor competitions or demonstrations of skill were conducted with quiet attention rather than loud display. And through all of this, social bonds strengthened, knowledge was shared, and human life continued steadily. As night fully descended, the band settled completely. Children cuddled close to adults. Elders rested in comfort. Animals curled at the edges. Stars sparkled in the unpolluted sky. Fires glimmered faintly, the embers glowing like slow, deliberate heartbeats of the day. The air was calm, the band was safe, and for each of them, from Thog's wandering curiosity to Mira's careful order, from Grack's steady guidance to the children's gentle learning, the day ended as it always did, slowly, predictably, quietly. And now, as we leave them, it is worth letting our minds drift along with the slow rhythm of their lives. No excitement, no heroics, just the steady, patient pulse of human existence. Observation, learning, cooperation, small victories, gentle amusement, quiet reflection, and rest. The embers fade, the stars shine, breathing slows. The world is calm. And in that calm, we find the simplest truth. Life, even tens of thousands of years ago, was enough in its gentle, repetitive rhythm. So, good night. Let your thoughts drift softly, like clouds over distant hills, like stars over quiet fires, like Thog, Mira, and Grack finally resting after a long day. Sleep deeply, safely, and gently. Tomorrow, like yesterday, will arrive slowly, quietly, and with its own subtle, patient rhythm. Good night.